Hi guys, I wanted to go through how I created the story clip card for my study on Revelations 12, and I thought you guys would enjoy seeing how we do that and maybe try some of your own. So what I did was I just took some manila cardstock and some regular newspaper, and I took a matte medium by Ranger, which is kind of like a non-porous glue, and I utilized it onto the card and then stuck the newspaper over it so that it would stick really well, and then I dried it really good with my heat gun so that it was nice and stuck. I wanted it to be really subtle, so what I did was I took some Distress ink by Ranger in different colors of greens and browns, and I colored over the top of the newspaper with them. I used a baby wipe to kind of spread them out some so that it would smear it out and make it really, really like vintage looking. But then I realized that the words were coming through still a little too much on the newspaper, so I went back and I took some white gel medium or gesso, and I went ahead and just put a thin layer of gesso over the top of the inks and stuff that I did, and I went ahead and dried that with my heat gun. And then I just went back and did that same process again with the inks that I had used before and went over the top, so it basically has two layers now. And once I got that spread out with my baby wipe really well with the inks, I took the brown and did the same thing. I think that was a vintage photo is the color of that, but I'll list all of the supplies below so that you guys know what I used. And then I just took my black archival ink and my brown archival ink, and I used it on the top with a little feather stamp and just created a pattern on the background, so it kind of gave it some layers and some texture for the background. And then I took the black archival ink and just went around the edges and kind of gave it a little bit of a frame. So this, I just went ahead and stamped these books. I have this is a Ranger stamp, and I stamped it onto some cardstock and I cut it out, and I took my markers. These are my Copic markers, and what I did was I took them and I just blended the colors together and colored in the books in the yellows and oranges and reds so that it would have kind of a vintage look to it as well. I wanted to go with a vintage look because these books remind me of like going into like an old library, and where you're looking for these great, amazing stories that have lasted through the years. And since I'm trying to remind myself to tell my story and not to be afraid to tell the story that God has given me about my life and my testimony, I wanted it to kind of have this vintage look, because it's important that we remember that our testimonies are important for other people, and we need to be able to be brave and share those testimonies with them. And that's what Revelations 12 was about. It was basically, we are victorious by the words of our testimony, which means that we can help and contribute to God's kingdom, and we can help in the spiritual realm if we are brave and we share our stories and our testimony. So what we're doing here is I am putting on the matte medium again, and I'm covering it up completely all over the image so that it sticks down really, really well, and also it creates a non-porous surface so that I can use my markers later to go ahead and blend and shadow. And then I just trimmed around the edges so that it would be even with the page. I use my brown Pitt pen marker, which I love. It's my favorite marker. It's the brown, and it doesn't dry. It dries permanent, but because I'm on the non-porous surface, I can smooth it around with my fingers a little bit and create shadows prior to it drying. It gives you just a few minutes to work with it, and then once it dries, it does dry permanent. So I just shadowed around the edges of the books and kind of blended them together so that they looked more like they were blended onto the page instead of just layered onto the page. And then I took my bigger brush pens and I used the orange and the red and the yellows to just give it a darker shadow for each one so that it kind of gave it that more of a vintage look as well. So it just kind of shadowed it in. And there you can kind of see how I did that. And then I decided that the books needed some highlighting, so I went ahead and took my white gel pen and highlighted around the edges of the books and on the bindings and on the pages. There's no really rhyme or reason to it. I wasn't going in straight lines. I just kind of gave it some highlights here and there so that it looked more realistic. And then I decided that the edges weren't quite dark enough yet. So what I did was I went ahead and I did some splatter paint first. So I took some ink and added water to it, and I splattered it onto the page so it had these cute little splatters. which you'll see me do a lot in my clip cards. I love doing splatter paints. And then once that was dry, I took my brown vintage paper or vintage photo ink, and I decided to go ahead and do the edges a little bit more darker with my finger dauber, because the edges weren't quite dark enough for me, and I really wanted it to be more framed out. So I took that dauber and I just framed out the edges as much as I could, and it kind of gave it a vintage shadow look, which I really, really love on here. And then I decided that my words were going to be share your story, so that it would remind me every time to share my story with others. So I wanted story to be a little bit bigger, so I used stamps to do the word story, and I made them a little bit darker. And then I took my fine Sharpie marker and I went ahead and wrote out share your in just a faux calligraphy, which is just, it's not really calligraphy, but you can make it look calligraphy if you're going to add in thicker lines and areas on the downstrokes of each of your letters. So if that helps you to figure out where you want to put your thicker part, you just do those on the downstroke. And then I went through and I highlighted it with my white gel pen so that the words would stand out a little bit more. And that gave it just that little extra that I like. And so that's kind of what it looks like. You're going to see a close-up in just a minute, but I went ahead and I got my Bible out so that you guys could see how I use these. And by the Revelations 12, where I did all my study and my writing, I went ahead and stuck this clip card in there so that the next time I open to that page, it is going to remind me of what I learned and how I should share my story. I hope this got you guys inspired to do something in your own Bible, and I hope you have a great week. Love you guys.